Okay, good morning, everyone. We are at the panel From Small Wars to Nuclear Weapons, Lessons from French Military Ventures in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Ben Brower. I teach history at the University of Texas at Austin. So I suppose it's my duty or my pleasure to welcome you to the great state of Texas if you're coming from far away and foreign places like Minnesota or Maine, although the weather might not indicate that you are all that dépaysé, as it were. But in any case, a warm welcome for me to San Antonio and to this conference. We have an hour and a half. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule with about 20 minutes for each presenter. That'll give us enough time for some comment and discussion from the audience, the various richest sort of part of all of these meetings I know. So I'll try to keep my introductions brief, although I could say many things and go on a length that for all of our presenters. I will be presenting people in turn. Our first speaker today is Andrew Orr from Kansas State University, who will be presenting a paper, The Double Plan, French Views of German and Soviet Influence in Post-World War I Middle Eastern Insurgencies. Professor Orr comes to us from Kansas State, but he's also something of a Texan himself, having started his career at Sam Houston State. He is a social and cultural historian of French military history. He works on the Army and the intelligence services, and more broadly on the French right. So please join me in welcoming Professor Orr to our discussion.
Yes. Thank you. Once again this morning, I'm reminded of how timing is everything in life and how one should think carefully about the dates in which commitments fall due. There's nothing like waking up realizing you've agreed to give a paper that's being videotaped on the same day your major fellowship application is due. So hopefully this paper will not go that badly. It is good to be back in Texas. I even ran into one of my former students on the Riverwalk last night, which was really kind of disturbing in its way. Apparently you can temporarily escape Texas, but you cannot escape the Texans. They will hunt you down no matter where you are. The events of this year are the preamble of the victorious fight of the East against the West and of Asia against Europe. We have united together, and soon independent Asia will reverse Western imperialism. This is not the latest proclamation from ISIS. It is a quote from an unknown Turkish journalist, which was reprinted as the header of a 21 September 1920 report titled The Present Danger of Islam, issued by the French Army Service de Renseignement, or SR section, based in Mandatory Syria. In the 49-page report, the SR's officers in Syria warned that German, Bolshevik, and British policies had energized a pan-Islamic movement which they claimed sought to expel France and, ironically, Britain itself from their Middle Eastern and South Asian possessions. This paper seeks to understand how this study saw Middle Eastern politics, to sort of understand the micro-mechanics of what the French thought was going on and why they thought it was going on at the time. In essence, this paper has become an extended think piece designed to force me to start grappling with this unusual and complex intelligence document. The Present Danger of Islam is unusual because of both its length and its comprehensive ambition. SR reports usually fell into one of two categories. Either they reported discrete pieces of intelligence, so-and-so was seen in this city, speaking to people about arms transfers or something, or they summarized all intelligence in a specific location over a regular period of time. What happened in Damascus over the last week? What happened in Turkey over the last month? Were the main ways that they reported information. This report, however, was not linked to any single piece of intelligence, and it wasn't limited to any of the normal geographical or temporal divisions. And quite unusually, not only did it seek to present a comprehensive explanation of what was happening in the Middle East, but it even presented specific policy recommendations that the French government should take. And this was extraordinarily unusual. well, in most SR documents. Because of its explicit policy advocacy, the report must have been approved by the SR's division chief in Syria, though it may or may not have been what he really believed. Certainly, it was at least something that he wanted French officials to believe that he believed, which can be different from what an intelligence service actually thinks is going on, especially a French intelligence service's view of what's happening. The report's authors argued that Islam was at the heart of their security problems. They warned that rising pan-Islamic sentiment risked creating regional chaos because, quote, in Islam there is no country. They explained that by saying, quote, by ignoring the idea of a homeland, the push for a pan-Islamic state could only lead to a total destabilization of the world. So no overstatement there. They depicted this as a protean struggle being waged between the West and radicalized Muslims. They claimed that the report proved that, quote, Islam is preparing itself to face the Western world. They are two totally different mentalities and instinctively repel each other. To Muslims, the Levant supposedly represented, again quoting, the land of revelation, and that it was dominated by, quote, the force of faith and undebatable truth, while Europe was, quoting again, the land of free examination and the desire to clear away doubt through discussion and reason. It is therefore the law of God against a world which obeys human laws based on knowledge. Some of the report's language clearly implied an inherent and timeless conflict, but other parts of the report claimed that the conflict was new and firmly rooted in the experience of the Great War. These sections argued that the latent Muslim threat had coalesced only because of the actions of outside agitators, specifically other European powers which had activated the different strands of the potential pan-Islamic revolt in order to achieve their own narrow geopolitical goals. Thus, while claiming that the East-West conflict was organic, the authors took pains to blame it on the actions of other Europeans. The report presented pan-Islamism as an umbrella category that covered a number of movements which would not normally be categorized as pan-Islamic. The SR's report identified three streams within the region, including one that exploited a generalized, quoting, Muslim discontent and throughout the Middle East, but apparently especially in Persia, Afghanistan, and India. The second stream, which was much better explained in the report, was Pan-Arabism, and focused on an area between Iraq and Egypt, including French-occupied Syria. Finally, there was the Turkish national movement of Mustafa Kemal, which the report described as being, quote, pan-Turkish, and sometimes conflated with the idea of loyalty to a universal caliphate. Given that the two main organized movements subsumed within this report's definition of pan-Islamism were not actually primarily based on Islam or a vision of a universal Islamic state, the authors were either fundamentally misunderstanding the origins of anti-colonial movements, or more likely they were using an Orientalized conception of Islam to try and delegitimize these movements. Other claims in the report made it clear that France's opponents were more likely to be motivated by a nationalist desire for self-government than by a religious crusade, but by emphasizing the fact that they were Muslims and thus different from Western Europe, French SR officers were able to create this sense that anti-colonial activists were a dangerous and unreasoning other that had to be both fought and ruled by sensible European men. The report aimed most efforts to create an independent Arab state on outside agitators. In particular, the report's authors argued that the British had opened a Pandora's box when they had encouraged the Arab revolt during the First World War. They severely criticized the British for promising to support an independent Arab state in exchange for many Arab leaders' help against the Ottoman Empire. They explained that British agents had fed, quote, the pretensions of Arab chiefs who would otherwise have been content with having local authority and made, quote, them thirst for a power they had never dreamed of having. They also chastised Woodrow Wilson's promises of self-determination and claiming that they had effectively magnified the promises the British had made. SR officers explained that the British had sought and were still seeking to manipulate Pan-Arabism, quote, in order to establish its influence over the Muslims of Arabia to counterbalance French influence in the East. To this aim, the British had allegedly backed Hussein bin Ali and his sons Faisal and Ali in their revolts against the Ottoman Empire in order both to exclude the Turks and the French from the post-war Middle East. As evidence of this, they pointed to David Lloyd George's attempts to get the Paris Peace Conference to support Faisal's claim to rule Syria, and the later creation of kingdoms in Iraq and Transjordan for Hussein's sons. The Syrian-based SR officers believed that the British and Faisal, who in September 1921 had just been installed as king of Iraq, were still hoping to drive the French out of Syria. They blamed Faisal and his British patrons for arming and organizing bands of rebels to harass French troops in the Syrian countryside. They also blamed Faisal and the British for organizing urban protest movements, which they claimed were stoking religious hatred to turn the people of the major cities against the French mandatory government. They also alleged that the British government was funding propaganda campaigns in France, Syria, and other European states, as well as the United States, against French rule in Syria. This propaganda allegedly took the form of efforts to get anti-French and pro-Faisal articles in the press, supporting anti-French committees in Syria, trying to discredit supporters of the mandate in Paris, and organizing committees in Geneva to exert sustained pressure on the League of Nations to cancel the mandate. The report identified the Kemalists in Turkey as the most dangerous form of pan-Islamism, which, given Kemal's later activities, is certainly an interesting designation for him to earn. It explained that, quote, the pan-Islamic peril takes a special character in Turkey since the alliance concluded by the Ankara government and the Soviets. In their eyes, the SR believed that this agreement, the February 1921 Treaty of Moscow, was a revolutionary development because it was contrary to the traditions followed by the Turkish nation up until now, and that it was, quote, contrary to the policies of the Tsars as well. It thus threatened, they believed, to turn Turkey from its traditional role of being a geographic barrier to Russian influence in the Middle East into a launching pad for it. The SR interpreted the September 1920 Congress of Eastern Peoples in Baku as evidence that the Soviets were aiming to use pan-Islamism as a weapon against the West. The Congress had been organized by the Bolshevik government in Russia and involved over 1,500 delegates representing peoples from North Africa to China, including illegal delegations from several British and French colonies and protectorates. The officers did not, however, see this as a sign that the Russians were motivated by communist ideology. Instead, they attributed to the Bolsheviks being, quote, the natural inheritors of Russian policies against Britain, and they claimed that the Bolsheviks were using communist ideology to cloak their own imperialist intentions so as not to alarm the reconstituted Central Asian nations, as they termed them. As a result, the Bolsheviks preferred to act through others, often the Turks, who had, the SR argued, been chosen by communist theoreticians as Russian delegates in the struggle for the Middle East. The combination of Russian propaganda and in Central Asia and Turkish relations with Arab dissidents led the authors of the report to claim that the Bolsheviks were seeking to ally with the Turks to take advantage of this vague concept of Muslim discontent to provoke revolts against British rule. This effort was a joint project of the Russians and their Turkish proxies, and its character was, quote, clearly offensive. It aimed to establish Turkish and Russian power in the Caucasus and Central Asia to open the way for an attack on India and perhaps the broader Middle East. Although these revolts were meant to appear organic local conflicts, they were really part of a, quote, fight directed by Russia and Turkey against Britain in India. The report its authors believe that the movement in Central Asia was, quote, provoked by Soviet actions. The Bolshevik leaders, in order to threaten Britain and India, have decided to exploit the discontent of Muslims provoked by the Entente's imperialistic tendencies. The report, however, claimed that another force was lurking behind the entire pan-Islamic movement, Weimar Germany. Although never in the forefront and rarely in public view, the authors believe that Germany is continuing the Great War by other means, by trying to weaken the victorious powers. Germany was doing this in alliance with both the Kemalists and the Russian Bolsheviks. The report described the German-Turkish relationship by saying that the Germans are in constant contact with the Turkish military chiefs, their recent allies. They claimed that one of the ways that Germany maintained this contact was through a network of couriers, including Anwar Pasha, who had made regular trips to Berlin and to Soviet Russia as well as Kemalist territory. In addition, they identified various, quote, German delegates in Tbilisi and other German missions, which the authors suggested were supporting Turkish and even Russian operations in both Anatolia and the Caucasus. The authors reminded their superiors that Imperial Germany had sought to mobilize Muslims against the Entente before and during the Great War, and warned that these efforts had finally borne fruit. Islam, raised in revolt by an Eastern European, has become a grave danger. Encouraged by the weakness of the Allies, exhausted by the war, by the spectacle of their interceding in conflicts, Muslim leaders have spoken loudly, the report claimed. And the authors reminded their superiors there had been German leaders who had persuaded the Ottoman Sultan to declare holy war as a way to undermine the French and British empires. They summarized their views by writing that, quote, the fight against France and Britain has been organized behind the scenes by Germany in order to weaken them in their Muslim possessions. They went on to claim that the overall origins of the threat is they went on to summarize the overall origins of the threat by saying that Islamism is not just a Muslim danger, but also a Bolshevik danger, and one part German and the other part British, which, as I count, comes to about 4 parts, but that really didn't seem important to them. They concluded one of their arguments by claiming that we cannot insist too strongly that that in the pan-Islamic movement, Germany is rebuilding its pre-war dream of taking a preponderant position in the region, and the Bolsheviks are seeking to be masters of Asia Minor and Central Asia. The report warned that as dangerous as the Turkish-German-Soviet axis was to France, it was also aimed at Britain in India. The officers believed that there was therefore hope that Britain was finally beginning to awake to the danger now that India was threatened. The report then reminded its readers that, quote, these two principal movements, Pan-Arabism and Mustafa Kemal's national movement, are only two different forms of the general Muslim force. Islam gravely threatens Britain and France. The authors went on to ask, is it not their common duty to each other to unite their actions in order to respond decisively? Once the Entente was reconstituted, the authors suggested a 2-point plan to defeat this, quote, Muslim force that was confronting them. The first part was the surveillance of propaganda centers and the organization of counter-propaganda. The major propaganda centers they identified were Berlin, Cairo, Constantinople, Amman, Jerusalem, and Jeddah. This was explained as mainly, quote, a question of money and the choice of agents. In other words, just as much of the attack on Europe's empires was surreptitious, so too would be the defense. British and French agents would monitor and disrupt these networks whenever possible by intercepting communications, closing down subversive organizations, and generally harassing enemy agents while trying to suppress as much of the propaganda as possible. The report also urged French leaders to create a counter-propaganda organization. It was to be modeled on the alleged German organization, and so it would include a Paris committee to be a counterpoint to the Berlin committee. It would act as a clearinghouse for funds and news, and would create daughter committees throughout the Muslim world in order to boost support for colonial rule through corrupting newspaper editors, planting stories, and influencing cultural movements. Good luck with that. one might say. The SR officers also recommended creating a permanent committee on Muslim affairs to coordinate the French government's Middle Eastern policies. The committee would receive all intelligence information collected by military and other civilian government agencies. It would also be separate from and superior to the Paris Committee, and thus would oversee the full range of diplomatic, colonial, military, economic, and propaganda policies throughout the Muslim world. Because the present danger of Islam is an unusual document, it should not be taken at face value. Although there is little reason to believe its authors were wholly disingenuous, nor should their individual and collective interests in creating it be ignored. The archival sources do not reveal which officers worked on the report, and so I cannot trace their backgrounds. But the Syrian branch of the SR and its local masters clearly had a vested interest in attracting official attention and the additional resources that would entail to Syria, and certainly presenting in a comprehensive enemy gravely threatening to French interest is a traditional way for a military force to convince a government that it needs a bigger budget. The SR reports clearly Europeanized Middle Eastern politics. The scenario sketched out in the report consistently blamed other European states, Russia, Germany, and Britain, for inspiring Muslims to take up arms against European and colonialism instead of focusing on British and French imperialism itself as the cause of problems in the Middle East. The report's authors regularly overinterpreted individual reports to make them fit into the broader narrative they were pushing. The report also reflects a striking level of interest in propaganda as a decisive weapon. Some French intelligence reports from the period spoke of specific German and Russian economic aid and weapons transfers, but the majority of the alleged actions the present danger of Islam presented consisted of little more than propaganda in the form of press reports, pamphlets, and even simple rumor mongering. Nevertheless, French officers seemed to be truly frightened by the power of these weapons of the weak. They presented the existence of committees of exile in Berlin or Switzerland as serious threats to the stability of colonial rule, despite not having any concrete proof that any of these groups had ever caused any specific event inside one of their empires to happen. Germany's overt attempts to win the support from Muslims before and during the First World War, and their support for the concept of jihad against the Entente, clearly had an influence on how the French continued to view the post-war world. They also seem to have been influenced by British officers' own misunderstandings of how much control the British had had over the Arab revolt. As Ali Awali has recently demonstrated, the British vastly overestimated their own role in both sparking and leading the Arab revolt, and the French seem to have taken their cue from the British in believing that this major movement had been created by the British and controlled by them the entire time. Another possible influence on the report's seemingly, and I think actually paranoid view of the Middle East is that French officers were drawing too much on their own political context back in France, in which networks of newspapers often played a key role in organizing political parties. The close links between newspapers and political parties and even individual politicians may have made French officers especially sensitive to the political role of the press in other societies. We should also be careful not to overinterpret this document and ourselves. As Martin Thomas has shown, colonial officials had a wide array of views of discontent and potential challenges to their authority, and this report should be interpreted in light of that fact. It was not the only perspective that French officials in Syria had, but it was clearly held by enough people to warrant a major report, which means it reflects one important view that informed France's imperial project in the post-war Middle East. And with that, I have actually finished.